Have you ever felt a shiver, a strange, undeniable pull, when you stand on a hill in the British countryside, looking out over the misty valleys? Maybe a sense that the ground beneath your feet holds secrets far older than the stones that built the castles. A mystery as deep and silent as the standing stones of Stonehenge, or the chalk-white horses carved into the hillsides, their purpose lost to time. We know they are ancient, but who carved them? Why? We are surrounded by these silent, strange facts of a past we can only half imagine. A past of tribal kingdoms and warrior queens, of a Britain before the Romans came to claim it. A world of swirling mists and druidic rites, where the lines between myth and history blur with every breath of the wind. A world where tribes like the Iceni and the Brigantes were not footnotes in history, but living, breathing, and fiercely independent peoples. A world that was about to be changed forever. I'm glad you're here, wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. If you're feeling up to it, post your location and local time in the comments. I love to see where everyone is listening from. Long before the first Roman soldier set foot on the shores, Britain was a place of diverse and powerful tribal kingdoms, a mosaic of Iron Age cultures that had been developing for centuries. The people of this island, whom the Romans would later call Britons, were a collection of Celtic-speaking tribes, each with its own customs, leaders, and territories. Think of them less as one unified nation, and more as a loose collection of family feuds, shifting alliances, and territorial squabbles, all happening on a grand scale. To the north, you had the Brigantes, a vast and powerful confederation that held sway over much of what is now northern England. Their territory so large, it was a kingdom unto itself, a kind of ancient superpower. They were a formidable force, and any would-be conqueror would have to reckon with them. To the south, in what we now call East Anglia, the Iceni were a people of farmers and warriors, known for their fierce independence and their intricate, beautiful metalwork. They were a kingdom, but they were about to become something else entirely, a symbol of defiance. On the other side, in modern-day Wales, the Silures inhabited the rugged, mountainous terrain, their strength born of a land that was as hard to conquer as they were. These weren't just names on a map. They were living societies with chieftains and councils, priests and farmers, and they were all fiercely protective of their lands. One of the great historical mysteries of this period is the sheer number of these tribes. The geographer Ptolemy listed nearly 24, but it's believed there were many more smaller ones, and we simply don't have the records to know for sure. How did they interact? Were the alliances as fleeting as they seem? It's a bit like trying to piece together a 1,000-year-old game of Risk with half the board missing. A fascinating, if frustrating, puzzle. What we do know is they were connected by a shared culture. They spoke related languages, practiced similar forms of Celtic paganism, and were all part of a larger, pan-Celtic world that stretched from Ireland to Anatolia. The Druids, those enigmatic priest-class figures, played a significant role in this. They were not just religious leaders. They were also judges, teachers, and keepers of oral history. Their influence, a blend of spiritual authority and political power, provided a kind of cultural glue that held these disparate groups together. We only have Roman accounts of them, which are, a bit biased. It's like getting a review of your favorite show from someone who only watched the pilot. A hypothesis, however, suggests that their power was so great and so feared that the Romans made it a point to systematically destroy them and their sacred places, effectively erasing their side of the story from the historical record. The land itself was a character in this story. Britain was a place of deep, dark forests and wild, untamed coasts. Travel between the tribal kingdoms was difficult, which may have contributed to their distinct identities. There were no paved roads, no Roman-style infrastructure, just muddy tracks and ancient pathways. The villages were often clusters of round houses, built from wood and thatch, their smoke-filled interiors a contrast to the chill of the outside air. The people farmed, they raised livestock, and they fought. Warfare wasn't just about conquest, it was also about honor, about cattle raids, and about defending one's territory. They used iron weapons, beautiful and deadly, and their chariots were a fearsome sight on the battlefield. The Celtic warriors painting their bodies with woad, a plant-based blue dye to strike terror into their enemies. These tribes were tough, resilient, and they were about to face a force unlike any they had ever encountered. The first whispers of Rome, of its endless legions and insatiable ambition, were already drifting across the sea. A new chapter in their long history was about to be written in blood, while the British tribes lived their lives, a world away across the sea. Something was happening in Rome that would change their destiny forever. The most famous of all Roman generals, a man whose name still echoes through history, was looking for a new conquest. His name was Julius Caesar, and his campaign in Gaul, modern-day France, was nearing its conclusion. But the Gallic tribes had received support from their British cousins, a fact Caesar couldn't ignore. He saw Britain not just as a source of troublesome allies for his enemies, but as a place of immense potential wealth, a land of tin, lead, and perhaps most importantly, a chance for an even greater triumph. So, in 55 BC, he made his move, launching the first, albeit brief, Roman incursion into Britain. It wasn't a full-scale invasion. It was more of a reconnaissance mission, a show of force, a kind of "we're here and we're not afraid" message. He landed near what is now Deal, on the Kent coast, and was immediately met with a fierce response. The British tribes, led by chieftains, whose names we barely know, had no standing army, but were a formidable fighting force in their own right. They used their chariots to great effect, a terrifying sight for the Roman legions who were used to fighting on solid ground. This initial encounter was a bloody affair, and Caesar was forced to withdraw before the end of the year, his ships battered by a storm, and his legions a bit shaken by the experience. A year later, in 54 BC, he came back with a larger force, over 800 ships and 5 legions, a truly massive undertaking for its time. The second expedition was a bit more successful. He pushed inland, crossing the Thames, and faced a coalition of tribes led by a chieftain named Cassivellaunus. Cassivellaunus was the chief of the Catuvellani, a powerful tribe whose territory lay north of the Thames. He was a master of guerrilla warfare, avoiding a direct confrontation, and instead using the land to his advantage, launching hit-and-run attacks on the Roman supply lines. It was a strategy that would be used against the Romans again and again. The Roman army, a machine designed for open-field battles and grand fortifications, was ill-equipped to deal with this kind of skirmishing in the muddy, forested British countryside. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, eventually forced a truce, but he never truly conquered the island. He left with promises of tribute, which, of course, were never paid. He had shown the world that Britain could be reached, and more importantly, that it was not an unconquerable fortress. But the price had been high, and he had gained little of tangible value. It was a lesson his successors would have to learn from. One of the great historical mysteries of this period is the identity and true power of these early British leaders. Cassivelaunus, for instance, is the first British leader to be named in a historical document, but we know almost nothing about him outside of Caesar's account. Was he a powerful king, a military leader, or simply a temporary chieftain who rose to the occasion? Another mystery is the exact location of his stronghold, which Caesar's forces besieged. Historians have hypothesized that it was near modern-day Wheathampstead, but the evidence is circumstantial at best. The details are lost in the mists of time, obscured by the fact that the British tribes had no written language, leaving us with only the Roman perspective, which, let's be honest, was probably more spin than history. My own little hypothesis is that the British tribes were far more organized and coordinated than Caesar gives them credit for. A loose confederation that could mobilize quickly against a common enemy. The Romans, with their love of order and hierarchy, likely couldn't comprehend such a system, so they simply described it as a disorganized rabble. It's a bit of a historical chuckle, really. They were so confident in their superiority that they couldn't imagine a people who fought so effectively without a centralized command structure. Caesar's incursions, while not a conquest, had a lasting impact. They broke the isolation of the island and brought Britain into the orbit of the Roman world. From that point on, Britain was a known quantity, a target, a prize waiting to be claimed. For the next century, the British kingdoms largely returned to their old ways, but with a new awareness. They began to trade more with the Roman world, their chieftains adopting some Roman customs and goods, and a kind of cultural osmosis began to take place. They were, in a sense, a people on the brink of an even greater change. The Romans, for their part, took their time. They had a whole empire to manage after all, but the seed had been planted. The tantalizing thought of a rich, new province lingered in the minds of Roman emperors, and in a little over a century, one of them would finally decide to finish what Caesar had started. This time, it wouldn't be a raid. It would be a full-scale invasion. And the tribes of Britain would have to face the full might of the Roman Empire, a storm of iron and discipline that would wash over their shores. After Caesar's 2 fleeting visits, a century of relative peace passed, but the idea of Britain as a Roman province never truly faded. It was a tantalizing target for ambitious emperors, a final piece to a continental puzzle. The opportunity arose under Emperor Claudius, a man who, despite his physical infirmities and awkward demeanor, was an ambitious and surprisingly effective ruler. He needed a military triumph to solidify his reign, which had begun under a cloud of political intrigue. The year was 43 AD, and the pretext for invasion was a deposed British king, a man named Boudica, who had fled to Rome seeking help. Claudius saw his chance. He assembled an enormous invasion force, 4 legions plus their auxiliaries, an army of over 40,000 men. This was not a raid, but a full-blown conquest. The Roman general in charge was Aulus Plautius, a seasoned veteran, and he led the legions across the English Channel, landing, most likely, near modern-day Richborough in Kent. This time the British tribes were not so easily surprised, but they were no match for the professional Roman army. The initial Roman advance was swift and brutal. The main resistance came from the Catuvellauni, the same tribe that had faced Caesar's armies. Their leaders, now Caratacus and Togodumnus, sons of the king Cunobelinus, a king who had ruled a large swathe of southeast Britain, attempted to halt the Roman advance at the Battle of the Medway and the Battle of the Thames. These were the first major pitched battles of the invasion, and they were a slaughter. The Roman legions, with their disciplined formations and superior armor, simply overwhelmed the British warriors. The Britons were brave, but their tactics of individual valor and disorganized charges were no match for the Roman war machine. Togodumnus was killed, and Caratacus fled westward, leaving the heartland of the Catuvellauni open for conquest. This was the moment Claudius had been waiting for. He himself traveled to Britain to lead the final push, a grand theatrical gesture meant to cement his legacy. He entered the Catuvellauni capital, Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester, with his legions and even an elephant, a sight that must have been both terrifying and utterly baffling to the native Britons. He accepted the surrender of 11 kings and then returned to Rome, leaving Plautius to complete the conquest. The initial invasion was a success, but it was just the beginning of a long and bloody campaign. This period holds a few historical mysteries that still puzzle scholars. For one, we don't know the exact landing site of the Roman army. While Richborough is the most likely candidate due to archaeological evidence, there is no definitive proof. Another mystery is the true fate of Togodumnus. Roman sources say he was killed, but some historians have hypothesized that he may have simply been captured or even defected, his death providing a convenient narrative for Roman propaganda. It's a funny thing about history. The more you dig, the more you realize how much of it is just a really good story told by the winners. My own hypothesis, a bit of sleepy conjecture if you will, is that the elephant wasn't just for show. Claudius was a man who understood spectacle, and bringing such a bizarre, terrifying beast to a battlefield was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Imagine being a British warrior, seeing a giant grey beast you've only heard rumors about, charging at you, with Roman soldiers on its back. It would have been utterly demoralizing. With the Catuvellauni defeated, the Romans began the slow, methodical process of conquering the rest of the island. They didn't just conquer with force, they also used diplomacy. They made treaties with friendly tribes, establishing client kingdoms that would serve as buffers against hostile ones. The kingdom of the Iceni, for example, under their king Prasutagus, initially allied themselves with Rome. This was a classic Roman strategy: divide and conquer. The Romans would advance, build roads, establish forts, and slowly but surely, their presence became a permanent feature of the landscape. As the legions pushed north and west, they encountered fierce resistance. The Silures, under the leadership of the brilliant Caratacus, who had now fled to Wales, were proving to be a stubborn and formidable foe. The conquest of Britain was far from over. It was just beginning, and the man who would come to define the British resistance for the next several years was just getting started. He had learned from his father's defeat and was about to lead a campaign that would test the very limits of Roman military might in Britain. A man who, even in defeat, would become a legend. With the initial Roman onslaught complete and the heart of the Catuvellauni kingdom in Roman hands, the true war for Britain was just beginning, and the man who would define the first decade of resistance was already on the move. His name was Caratacus, and he was a brilliant and cunning chieftain, a survivor of the initial defeats who had fled westward. He did not, however, simply melt into the hills. Instead, he began to do something extraordinary. He rallied the tribes of what is now Wales, specifically the Silures and the Ordovices, fierce and independent peoples who lived in the rugged terrain of the mountains and valleys. This was a masterstroke of leadership. He was not one of them by birth, yet he managed to forge a grand alliance against a common enemy, an enemy they all now knew was terrifyingly effective in open battle. Caratacus understood that you couldn't beat the Romans at their own game. His strategy was simple and devastatingly effective. Avoid pitched battles, use the treacherous landscape to his advantage, and engage in constant guerrilla warfare. For nearly a decade, from 43 to 51 AD, Caratacus became a thorn in the side of every Roman governor in Britain. He would lead raids on Roman supply lines, launch ambushes from the forests, and melt back into the hills before the legions could respond. It was an exhausting and demoralizing kind of war for the Romans. Their heavy armor and disciplined formations, so effective on the flat plains of Europe, were a hindrance in the narrow passes and wooded slopes of Wales. The Silures, in particular, were a formidable foe. Their reputation for ferocity was well known, and their homeland was a natural fortress. Roman accounts speak of a tenacious and brave enemy, one that bled the Roman war machine slowly but steadily. One of the greatest historical mysteries is how Caratacus managed to maintain this alliance for so long. The Celtic tribes were notoriously fractious, and holding a coalition together for 8 years against a relentless foe is a monumental achievement. Was he a charismatic leader, a political genius, or perhaps both? We simply don't know. We only have the Roman historian Tacitus's account, which, while detailed, is still written from the perspective of an impressed but frustrated enemy. The stalemate came to a head in 51 AD when the new Roman governor, Publius Ostorius Scapula, finally cornered Caratacus and his forces. The exact location is a matter of historical debate, but it was somewhere in the territory of the Ordovices in modern-day central Wales. Caratacus, in a final act of defiance, chose to make a stand on a steep, fortified hill. He built stone walls and defensive works and positioned his troops to take advantage of the high ground. He gave a rousing speech to his warriors, telling them that this battle would either lead to their freedom or their perpetual enslavement. For a moment, it seemed as if his strategy might work. The Romans hesitated, faced with a nearly impregnable position. But then, a soldier's discipline and a general's resolve took over. Scapula ordered his legions to advance, and they painstakingly climbed the hill under a hail of rocks and javelins. When they finally reached the top, the battle was quick and decisive. The Roman legions, now on even ground, broke the British line and routed the army of Caratacus. The battle was a major victory for the Romans, but Caratacus escaped. However, his luck was about to run out. He fled north to the kingdom of the Brigantes, hoping to find refuge with their queen Cartimandua, an ally of the Romans. This was a fatal miscalculation. Cartimandua, seeing an opportunity to gain favor with Rome, betrayed him. She handed Caratacus over to the Romans in chains, and he was shipped off to Rome. This was a moment of immense triumph for the empire. The most famous enemy of Rome in Britain was finally captured. What happened next is a moment of pure historical theatre. Caratacus was paraded through the streets of Rome, a prize for the emperor. When he was brought before Claudius, he gave a famous speech, asking why the emperor, who had so much wealth, would covet the simple homes of the Britons. He spoke with such dignity and courage that Claudius, impressed by his defiance, spared his life. This was an incredibly rare act of clemency for a captured enemy king. The fact that a captured British chieftain could be brought to Rome, speak to the emperor, and live to tell the tale is in itself a testament to his character and the respect he had earned from his enemies. My own little hypothesis is that Claudius saw a public relations opportunity. Sparing Caratacus showed the world that Rome was not just a brutal conqueror, but a benevolent ruler who respected a worthy foe. Caratacus's capture was a major setback for the British resistance. It left a vacuum of leadership, and for a while, it seemed as if the spirit of rebellion was broken. But as we'll soon discover, all it takes is one wrong move by an overconfident ruler to ignite a fire. After the capture of Caratacus, the Roman conquest of Britain seemed unstoppable. A slow, methodical grind that was only a matter of time. For a while, it was. The Roman province was expanding, new roads were being built, and towns were rising from the earth. The tribes who had resisted were being subdued, and those who had allied themselves with Rome were seemingly prospering, or so it appeared. Among these was the Iceni tribe, a people of farmers and skilled artisans in what is now East Anglia. Their king, Prasutagus, had been a client king, meaning he ruled his people with Rome's permission and was a loyal ally. But when Prasutagus died, a historical moment of profound miscalculation occurred. In his will, he had tried to appease Rome by leaving half of his kingdom to the Emperor Nero and the other half to his two daughters. This was a common practice in Roman law. But to the Romans, a client kingdom was a temporary arrangement, and upon the king's death, his territory reverted entirely to the Roman Empire. The new Roman governor, a man named Suetonius Paulinus, saw no reason to honor Prasutagus's will. Instead, he decided to seize the entire Iceni kingdom. This was done in a brutally efficient and utterly humiliating way. The Roman procurator, or financial officer, Catus Decianus, moved in to collect the money owed to the empire, treating the Iceni nobles as slaves and confiscating their property. The ultimate insult, however, was directed at Prasutagus's widow, the queen, Boudica. The Roman soldiers publicly flogged her and raped her two daughters. This was more than a political or financial dispute. It was a profound act of disrespect and a violation of every cultural norm the Iceni held dear. They had been loyal, and in return, they were treated with a cruelty that shocked them to their core. The Romans had just made their greatest mistake. They had underestimated the fury of a grieving queen and the power of a people pushed to the breaking point. Boudica, a woman described by Roman sources as tall, with long red hair and a piercing gaze, became the rallying cry for a rebellion that would shake the Roman Empire to its foundations. She united not just the Iceni, but also their neighbors, the Trinovantes, and other tribes who had grievances against Roman rule. The rebellion began in 60 or 61 AD. while Governor Paulinus was away on a campaign in Wales, attempting to crush the last vestiges of resistance. The rebels first targeted Camulodunum, the former capital of the Catuvellauni, and now a major Roman town and a symbol of Roman power. It was an easy target, poorly defended, and filled with retired Roman soldiers who were a bit too used to the easy life. The Britons descended on the town in a whirlwind of fire and blood. They burned it to the ground, slaughtering every Roman they found. The city of Londinium, modern-day London, a bustling commercial hub, was next. Paulinus, upon hearing of the revolt, raced back, but he knew he couldn't save the city. He abandoned it, a decision that sealed its fate. The rebels burned Londinium too, and then Verulamium, St. Albans, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. An estimated 70,000 to 80,000 people were killed in these attacks, a staggering number for the time. The Roman province of Britain was on the brink of collapse. One of the great historical mysteries of the Boudican revolt is the sheer speed and success of her initial campaign. How did she, a woman with no official military training, manage to raise such a large and effective fighting force so quickly and orchestrate the destruction of 3 major Roman settlements? Another mystery is the exact location of the final decisive battle between Boudica's forces and the Roman army led by Paulinus. We know it was somewhere along the Roman road known as Watling Street, but its precise location is still debated. Archaeologists have searched for it for centuries. It's a bit like trying to find a needle in a historical haystack, and the fact that we still haven't found it makes you wonder what other secrets the land is holding on to. My own little hypothesis is that Boudica's rage was so palpable, so powerful, that it acted as a force multiplier, uniting the fractious tribes in a way that no man, not even Caratacus, had been able to do. She wasn't just a leader. She was the embodiment of their collective anger and humiliation. The final battle was a tragic affair. Though Boudica had a massive army, her forces were disorganized, and they had chosen to fight on a narrow road. Paulinus, with his much smaller but highly disciplined force, used the terrain to his advantage, forming a defensive line that the British chariots and warriors couldn't penetrate. The Romans stood firm, and the battle turned into a massacre. Boudica's rebellion was crushed, and she likely took poison to avoid capture. The Iceni were largely wiped out, and Rome's hold on Britain was cemented. It was a brutal end, but it was also a testament to a woman who, in a moment of unimaginable pain, nearly brought an empire to its knees. With Boudica's rebellion brutally crushed, the Romans learned a crucial lesson about the ferocity of the Britons. From that point on, their policy shifted. They understood that conquest by pure military force alone was unsustainable. They needed to pacify the land and win the hearts, or at least the begrudging cooperation of the local population. The new governors, like Julius Agricola, who arrived in 77 AD, began a long process of consolidation and Romanization. This period was marked by the construction of permanent forts, the establishment of towns that served as centers of administration and trade, and the slow but steady creep of Roman culture, language, and law into the British way of life. It was a kind of hearts and minds campaign, with a heavy emphasis on the hearts part, but with a Roman legionary standing right next to you, just in case. They built baths and temples and forums, and encouraged the local elites to adopt Roman customs, offering them citizenship and political power in exchange for their loyalty. The Romans were, in a way, selling the idea of civilization, and for many of the tribal leaders, it was a pretty good deal. The military focus of the Roman Empire, however, was shifting northward. Agricola, a man with a taste for glory and a penchant for pushing the boundaries of the known world, set his sights on the unconquered territory of Caledonia, the land of the northern tribes. He led his legions on a series of campaigns that took them deep into what is now Scotland. These campaigns were brutal, fought in a rugged, cold, and unforgiving landscape against an enemy that was every bit as fierce as the Silures or the Iceni. The most famous moment of this period was the Battle of Mons Graupius in 83 AD. Agricola's forces faced a massive confederation of Caledonian tribes, led by a chieftain named Calgacus. Tacitus, the Roman historian and Agricola's son-in-law, put a grand speech in the mouth of Calgacus, in which he famously says, "They make a desert, and they call it peace." It's a quote that has echoed through the centuries as a bitter condemnation of Roman imperialism. The battle itself was a decisive Roman victory, a slaughter of the Caledonian tribes, but it was not a conquest. The Romans had defeated them in open battle, but they had not broken their spirit. This period is filled with fascinating historical mysteries. The most prominent one is the exact location of Mons Graupius. Despite Tacitus's detailed account, the site has never been definitively identified. Was it near Benaki? Or perhaps in the Grampian Mountains? Historians have debated it for centuries, and it remains one of the great open questions of Roman Britain. The fact that the Romans didn't leave a single stone behind to mark their greatest victory in the north is, in itself, a bit of a mystery, a kind of historical shrug, a historian's hypothesis, a sleepy little thought, is that the battle was so costly, even in victory, that the Romans realized that a full-scale conquest of Caledonia was not worth the trouble. My own little playful thought is that the weather was just so miserable that they decided to call it a day and head back south, where it was at least a little bit warmer and the locals were a bit less spiky. Following Mons Graupius, the Roman military presence in Caledonia was a bit of a back-and-forth affair. They established a series of temporary forts, but the supply lines were long and vulnerable, and the native tribes, who were as at home in the misty glens as a badger in its burrow, were a constant and demoralizing threat. Agricola was recalled to Rome, his great ambitions left unfulfilled, and the Roman military presence in Scotland began to slowly recede. The Roman Empire had finally met its match, not in a single battle, but in the combination of a difficult landscape and a determined, unyielding people. They had pushed the frontier as far as it would go. The decision was made to consolidate their power and draw a line in the sand, or rather, in the earth, a massive stone and turf line that would come to define the northern boundary of the Roman Empire for centuries. It was an admission of defeat, in a way, but also a pragmatic decision to focus their resources on holding what they had. The story of the Roman occupation of Britain was now to be a tale of consolidation and defense, a story of building walls. The decision to abandon the full conquest of Caledonia led to one of the most remarkable feats of Roman engineering and one of the most iconic symbols of Roman Britain, Hadrian's Wall. The Emperor Hadrian, a man who loved to travel and who believed in defining and defending the frontiers of his empire rather than expanding them endlessly, came to Britain in 122 AD. What he saw was a messy, undefended frontier, a no man's land where raids and skirmishes were a constant drain on Roman resources. His solution was to build a permanent, heavily fortified border, a stone monument to the limits of Roman power. This wasn't a wall to keep the barbarians out, as is the popular myth. It was a physical manifestation of a psychological boundary, a way of controlling trade and passage, and a powerful symbol of Roman authority. The building of the wall was a monumental undertaking, a project that took nearly 6 years and involved thousands of legionaries and auxiliaries. It stretched for 73 miles, from Wallsend on the River Tyne in the east to Bowness on Solway in the west. It was a complex and sophisticated structure, not just a simple wall. It had a V-shaped ditch in front of it, and behind it, a military road and a series of forts every 5 miles or so, with smaller mile castles in between. The wall itself was built of stone in the east and turf in the west, a testament to the differing availability of materials. And it was a permanent home for tens of thousands of Roman soldiers. Life along the wall was not always a grand adventure. It was a bit like being a border guard in a perpetually chilly and often rainy country. The soldiers stationed there were a mix of nationalities from across the empire: Germans, Syrians, Gauls, and many of them formed families and settled down in the small villages, or vicars, that sprang up outside the forts. The wall was a microcosm of Roman Britain, a melting pot of cultures. It was also a hotbed of activity. One of the greatest historical mysteries is the exact purpose of the wall itself. While its military function is obvious, its economic role is less so. Historians have hypothesized that it was more of a customs barrier, a way for the Romans to control trade and collect taxes from the northern tribes. Another mystery is the story of the wall's inhabitants. We only get glimpses of their lives through archaeological finds. Things like a little boy's tiny hobnailed sandal found at Vindolanda, a poignant reminder of the families who lived there, a world away from the grandeur of Rome. My own sleepy little thought is that the boredom must have been the greatest enemy of all. Imagine standing watch on a cold, windy day, staring out at the mist and the hills, with nothing to do but watch sheep and listen to the rain. I bet they invented some really terrible games to pass the time. The wall, however, was not the end of the story for the northern frontier. Just a few decades later, around 142 AD, the Emperor Antoninus Pius decided to push the frontier further north and built a new wall, the Antonine Wall, a much shorter turf and timber structure between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde in what is now Scotland. The building of the Antonine Wall is another open historiographic mystery. Why would the Romans build a new wall and abandon Hadrian's, only to retreat back to Hadrian's a few decades later? One hypothesis is that Antoninus was looking for a military triumph to secure his legacy, and an expansion of the frontier was a good way to get one. But the Caledonian tribes were as relentless as ever, and the logistics of supplying a frontier so far from the Roman heartland were a nightmare. The Antonine Wall was a brief and ultimately failed experiment. Around 160 AD, the Romans withdrew back to Hadrian's Wall, solidifying it as the permanent northern boundary of Roman Britain for the next 2 centuries. The wall became the defining feature of Roman Britain's northern frontier. It was a line of separation, a line of control, and a final admission that the vast, untamable north was beyond their grasp. It was a tangible symbol of a world divided between the Roman and the barbarian, a division that would shape the history of the island for centuries to come. The wall, with its crumbling stones and lonely watchtowers, is a silent monument to a time when Britain was a place of two worlds, one Roman and one not, and the line between them was a long stone snake across the land. It was a testament to the power of Rome, but also to its limitations. For all its might, there were some lands that simply refused to be conquered. With the northern frontier secured by Hadrian's wall, the Roman province of Britannia settled into a long period of relative peace and prosperity. This was a time when the Roman influence, which had previously been a military and administrative presence, began to truly sink into the fabric of British society. The Roman model of life, with its towns, its public buildings, and its stratified social structure, began to take hold, while the majority of the population still lived in rural settlements and small farms. A new way of life was emerging. Towns like Londinium, Verulamium, and Eboracum, York, grew into bustling hubs of commerce and culture, complete with forums, public baths, and amphitheaters. These weren't just Roman outposts. They were cosmopolitan centers where people from all over the empire, Gauls, Syrians, and Africans, lived and worked alongside the native Britons. The Britons themselves, particularly the elite, began to adopt Roman customs with an almost eager enthusiasm. They learned Latin, wore togas, and lived in villas that were often built in a Roman style, but with distinctly British touches. This process, known as Romanization, was not a forced conversion, but a gradual process of cultural osmosis. For the chieftains and noble families, embracing Roman ways was a way of gaining power and influence within the new system. It was a good business decision, really. Think of it as a kind of ancient networking. The Romans were very good at this. They didn't just conquer with the sword. They conquered with the promise of a better life, of law and order, and of material comforts. The Romans built roads that connected the entire province, making travel and trade faster and more efficient than ever before. For the first time, a traveler could go from Londinium to York on a well-paved road, a journey that would have been a muddy, miserable slog just a century before. This infrastructure was the backbone of Roman Britain, a testament to their engineering prowess. One of the great historical mysteries of this period is the extent of this Romanization. How deep did it really go? Did the average Briton on a remote farm speak Latin, or did they still speak their native Celtic tongue? It's a question that has no easy answer. The archaeological evidence, from Latin inscriptions to Roman-style pottery, suggests a widespread adoption of Roman culture. But this evidence is often biased towards the wealthy and the urban. A historian's hypothesis, a quiet thought in the night, is that the Romanization was a thin veneer, a kind of social performance for the Roman occupiers, and that for the majority of the population, life went on much as it always had. My own little playful theory is that they were all bilingual. They'd speak Latin to the tax collector and then complain about him in Celtic to their neighbor. It's a kind of historical shrug. We just don't know for sure. Roman Britain was not, however, a paradise. It was a highly stratified society. At the top were the Roman administrators and the wealthy Romanized Britons, and at the bottom were the slaves and the vast majority of the population who toiled on the land. The Roman system of law and taxation, while bringing a degree of stability, was often harsh and exploitative. The promise of peace came at a steep price, a price that was paid in taxes, in forced labor, and in the loss of traditional freedoms. The Romans were also not immune to their own internal conflicts. The province was often a pawn in the larger political games of the empire, a stage for ambitious governors and rebellious generals who would try to seize power for themselves. But for a long time, the walls held, the roads were used, and the villas were built. This was the high point of Roman Britain, a time when the island was a prosperous and integrated part of the Roman Empire, a quiet, sleepy corner of the world that was, for a time, a world away from the great conflicts that were beginning to brew on the continent. But even in this period of peace, there were rumblings on the northern and western frontiers, where the wild tribes were never truly subdued, a constant reminder that the Roman peace was a fragile thing. Even during the golden age of Roman Britain, the province was far from a perfectly tranquil land. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace, was often a fragile facade, easily shattered by internal power struggles and a series of smaller, but no less brutal, local revolts. The province was a strategic outpost for the Roman Empire, but this also made it a breeding ground for ambitious generals. These commanders, with legions at their disposal and a great distance from the watchful eye of the emperor in Rome, often saw Britain as a stepping stone to power. They would proclaim themselves emperor, gather their troops, and cross the channel to challenge the sitting ruler, a kind of ancient Roman version of a hostile takeover. This constant ebb and flow of legions to and from the continent left Britain's defenses vulnerable. The most famous example of this was the rebellion of Caratacus, a naval commander who, in the late 3rd century AD, declared himself Emperor of Britain and Northern Gaul. He ruled for 7 years before being assassinated by his own treasurer, Allectus, who continued the secessionist regime for 3 more years. These internal conflicts were a major drain on resources and a source of instability, pulling Roman soldiers away from their primary duty of defending the frontier. Beyond the grand schemes of rebellious generals, there were also smaller, localized revolts that flickered and flared like embers in the wind. The tribes, even those who had seemingly been Romanized, never truly lost their independent spirit. The Brigantes, in particular, a vast tribe in the north that had been a client kingdom, were a constant source of trouble. Their queen, Cartimandua, had been a Roman ally who famously betrayed Caratacus, but her reign was fraught with internal conflict, culminating in a rebellion led by her former husband, Venutius. The Romans had to intervene multiple times to support her, and when she was finally deposed, the Romans simply took over the territory, an act that undoubtedly led to further resentment. Another major rebellion, the Great Conspiracy, would come much later, but the seeds of discontent were always there, bubbling just beneath the surface of Roman order. The truth is, the Roman Empire was built on the backs of its conquered peoples, and while many Britons saw the benefits of Roman rule, many others saw it as a form of foreign oppression. One of the great historical mysteries is the true nature of these internal conflicts. Were they genuine nationalist rebellions, or were they simply a byproduct of the power vacuum created by Roman political instability? Were the Britons rebelling against Roman rule, or were they just taking sides in a Roman civil war? The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. The archaeological record gives us hints of destruction and rebuilding at certain sites, suggesting conflict, but it rarely gives us the full story. It's like finding a smashed plate and a half-eaten meal in a kitchen. You know a fight happened, but you don't know who started it or what it was about. A historiographic hypothesis, a quiet little thought, is that the Romanized elite, the Britons, who had the most to lose from a rebellion, were the ones who were most loyal to Rome. The rebellions, therefore, were led by those who had been marginalized or disenfranchised by the new order. My own little sleepy thought is that it was all just a bit of a misunderstanding. A general would get a new shiny hat and a few drinks, and suddenly he thinks he's the next emperor. Then he'd sober up and be like, "Oh dear, what have I done?" These internal conflicts had a profound and lasting effect on the province. They weakened Roman control, drained military resources, and provided opportunities for the native tribes to reassert their independence. They also show us that Roman Britain was not a static, perfectly controlled entity. It was a dynamic, often violent place, a land of shifting alliances and simmering resentments. The story of Roman Britain is not just a story of Roman conquest and culture. It's also a story of British resilience and defiance. A story that reminds us that even under the firmest of grips, the human spirit, especially the British one, has a knack for finding a way to resist. These moments of internal chaos were a prelude, a kind of historical dress rehearsal for the far greater challenges that would face the province as the Roman Empire itself began to crumble. Even with the consolidation of power and the building of Hadrian's Wall, the Romans' ambitions in Britain weren't entirely put to rest. The lands to the north, known to them as Caledonia, and inhabited by the fierce tribes they called the Picts, were a constant irritant. The Picts were not a single tribe, but a collection of peoples who lived in the rugged glens and highlands of Scotland, and their name, which means painted people, was a nod to their practice of tattooing their bodies with elaborate designs. They were skilled guerrilla fighters, and they would launch raids across the wall, a constant drain on Roman military resources. Over the course of the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD, a series of Roman emperors launched campaigns to try and subdue them once and for all. These expeditions were massive undertakings, a kind of renewed assault on a land that had so far proven to be unconquerable. The most notable of these campaigns were led by the Emperor Septimius Severus in 208 AD. He was a ruthless and pragmatic ruler, and he brought the full might of the Roman army to bear on the northern tribes. He and his sons Caracalla and Geta led a huge force of over 50,000 men into Scotland, building new roads and forts as they went, a kind of mobile fortress. The campaign was a brutal war of attrition. The Picts, as was their way, avoided pitched battles and instead used the landscape to their advantage, launching ambushes and attacking supply lines. They would retreat into the forests and mountains, a ghost-like enemy that the Romans couldn't seem to corner. The Roman legions, with their heavy armor and discipline, were like a sledgehammer trying to hit a mosquito. It was an exhausting and demoralizing kind of war, fought in a cold and rainy country far from home. Severus himself, an old and ailing man, died in York in 211 AD, having failed to achieve a decisive victory. His sons, who were more interested in fighting each other for the throne than fighting the Picts, quickly pulled the legions back to Hadrian's Wall. This period is rich with historical mysteries and open questions. The primary one is the purpose of Severus's campaign. Was it a genuine attempt to conquer Caledonia, or was it simply a way to keep his soldiers busy and his sons from killing each other? The fact that the Romans abandoned all the new forts and roads they built as soon as he died suggests it was more about internal Roman politics than a genuine conquest. Another mystery is the true identity and culture of the Picts. We have very little written about them from their own perspective, and what we do have is from Roman sources. The Pictish stones, with their elaborate and mysterious symbols, are one of our only clues, but we still don't know for sure what the symbols mean. A historiographic hypothesis is that the symbols are a form of a written language or a clan system. But the truth is, we have no idea. My own little sleepy thought is that the Romans, after all that effort, realized that a full-scale occupation of Scotland would have been a financial and military black hole, and they simply decided it wasn't worth the headache. I mean, who can blame them? They had an entire empire to worry about, and here were these spiky, unyielding people who just wouldn't stay conquered. The Caledonian campaigns were a kind of final, definitive statement on the limits of Roman power in Britain. They had pushed as far as they could, and the land and its people had pushed back and won. From this point on, the Roman presence in Britain was a defensive one. The legions stayed behind Hadrian's wall, content to patrol the frontier and keep the wild north at bay. The conquest of Britain was, in the end, an incomplete project. The Romans had their province, their roads, and their villas, but they never truly had the entire island. The legacy of these campaigns was not one of conquest, but of a grudging respect. The Romans knew that the lands beyond the wall were unconquerable, and the Britons knew that the Romans were a powerful but not omnipotent force. This was the uneasy peace that would last for the next 2 centuries, a peace that was slowly but surely beginning to unravel. As the 3rd century gave way to the 4th, the Roman Empire, a seemingly eternal behemoth, began to creak and groan under its own weight. This slow decline was not a single dramatic collapse, but a gradual unraveling, and its effects were felt keenly in distant provinces like Britain. The empire was beset by a multitude of problems: economic instability, political turmoil, and increasing pressure from so-called barbarian tribes on its frontiers. The Roman military, once a tool of relentless conquest, was now primarily a force of defense, stretched thin across thousands of miles of border. In Britain, this meant a slow but steady reduction of the Roman military presence. Legions were recalled to fight in continental civil wars or to defend more critical parts of the empire, leaving the province increasingly vulnerable to external threats. The Roman world was beginning to look inward, and Britain, once a jewel in the crown, was now seen as an expensive and difficult to defend outpost. The most pressing new threat came from the sea. Along the eastern and southern coasts of Britain, the tribes of Germania, whom the Romans collectively called Saxons, began to launch increasingly frequent and devastating raids. They were pirates and plunderers, sailing up the rivers in their long ships to sack towns and carry off slaves and treasure. The Roman response was a system of coastal defenses known as the Saxon Shore Forts. These were a chain of heavily fortified strongholds built along the coast from Norfolk to Hampshire, designed to deter and repel these seaborne invaders. The forts were a testament to the changing nature of the conflict. The Romans were no longer fighting a land war against Celtic tribes, but a defensive naval war against new enemies. This period also saw an increase in raids from the Picts in the north and the Scotti, a Gaelic tribe from Ireland, who were a new and significant threat to the western coasts. This era is filled with historical mysteries. The most profound one is the exact nature of the relationship between the Romans and the various Germanic tribes who began to settle in Britain. Were they all raiders and enemies, or were some of them invited in as federates or allies to help defend the province? We know that this was a common Roman practice on the continent. A historiographic hypothesis is that the Romans began to employ Saxon mercenaries to help defend the Saxon shore, a kind of historical irony that would have profound consequences. Another mystery is the true effect of the economic decline. The beautiful villas and grand towns of the Romanized elite began to fall into disrepair, and the monetary economy began to be replaced by a system of barter. The supply of new coins from the continent began to dry up, a silent but powerful symbol of the empire's withdrawal. My own sleepy thought is that the Britons must have felt a growing sense of unease. The Roman Empire, their protector and master for centuries, was slowly but surely fading away, leaving them alone to face the rising tide of new threats. The Roman Empire, in a way, was becoming a myth, a powerful memory that no longer held the same sway. The final and most significant blow to Roman authority came at the very end of the 4th century. In 410 AD, the Western Roman Emperor Honorius sent a letter to the cities of Britain, telling them to see to their own defense. It was a watershed moment, a kind of official abandonment. The empire facing a crisis closer to home. The Visigoths had just sacked Rome itself, simply could no longer spare the resources to defend this distant island. The legions were gone. The Roman administrators and a great deal of the Romanized elite likely departed as well, leaving the native British population, who had grown accustomed to Roman protection, to fend for themselves. This was the end of the Roman period in Britain, but it was also the beginning of a new and darker age, a period of chaos and fragmentation, where the old tribal kingdoms, now a blend of Roman and Celtic cultures, would have to find a way to survive without the hand of Rome to guide or defend them. The Great Roman Silence had begun. The year 410 AD marks the beginning of one of the most mysterious and debated periods in British history. With the Roman legions gone, the central authority that had held the province together for centuries simply vanished, plunging Britain into a chaotic, fragmented world known to historians as the sub-Roman or post-Roman period. This wasn't a sudden, cataclysmic collapse, but a slow descent into a power vacuum. The old Romanized administrative and legal structures crumbled, and the native British communities, who had become dependent on Roman protection, were left to fend for themselves. This was the moment of the Great Barbarian Conspiracy, a name given by the Roman historian Ammianus Marcellinus, to a coordinated series of attacks that occurred in 367 AD, but which continued in a less coordinated form well into the 5th century. Raids from the Picts in the north and the Scotti from Ireland, which had always been a nuisance, now became a terrifying existential threat. They were no longer repelled by disciplined Roman forces, but were free to raid and plunder the now defenseless towns and villas. The British leaders, a mix of old Romanized elites and resurgent tribal chieftains, tried to organize a defense. They sent desperate pleas to Rome for help, but none came. The famous letter from Emperor Honorius was the final answer. The Britons were on their own. The central authority of Rome was gone, and the island splintered into smaller, competing kingdoms. The urban centers, once the jewels of Roman Britain, began to decline. The great villas, with their mosaic floors and hypercaust heating, were abandoned and fell into ruin. The Roman roads, once a symbol of order, became overgrown and dangerous. A monetary economy largely ceased to exist, and the British began to rely on a barter system once again. A kind of historical regression to a pre-Roman world. This was a dark age, not in the sense of a lack of knowledge, but in the sense that the historical record is nearly silent. We have very few written sources from this period, and we are forced to piece together the narrative from archaeological evidence, later written accounts, and a great deal of informed speculation. One of the great historical mysteries of this time is the fate of the Romano-British population. Did they flee? Did they revert to their old Celtic ways? The archaeological evidence suggests a complex and varied picture. In some areas, Roman ways persisted for a long time, with people still living in villas and using Roman-style pottery. In others, the Roman veneer was quickly stripped away, and a new, distinctively British culture emerged. This is the period that gives rise to the legends of King Arthur, a legendary warrior who, according to later sources, led the Britons in a valiant struggle against invaders. Was Arthur a real person, a heroic leader who forged a temporary alliance and held back the tide of invaders? A historiographic hypothesis is that he was a powerful Romano-British chieftain, perhaps a cavalry commander, who used Roman tactics and discipline to fight the Saxon incursions. The truth, however, is a mystery lost to time. My own little sleepy thought is that he was a composite character, an amalgamation of several heroes, a figure of myth created to give a sense of hope to a people who desperately needed one, a historical figure to rally behind in a time of incredible strife and uncertainty. The Great Barbarian Conspiracy was a watershed moment. It wasn't just a series of raids. It was a fundamental shift in the power dynamics of the island. The Britons were no longer fighting as a Roman province. They were fighting as a collection of independent kingdoms, each with its own interests and its own enemies. The raids from the Picts and the Scotti were terrifying, but they were not the only threat. On the eastern coast, the same Saxon tribes that had once been a nuisance were now beginning to arrive, not just as raiders, but as settlers. They were invited by the British kings to act as mercenaries to help them fight off their enemies. This decision, a moment of tragic desperation, was a kind of historical Faustian bargain. The Britons had brought their future conquerors to their very doorstep, and the stage was set for the next, and perhaps most profound, chapter in the history of the island. The age of the Anglo-Saxons was about to begin. As the central authority of Rome dissolved, the island of Britain didn't just become a lawless wasteland. It fragmented into a mosaic of new, independent kingdoms, many of them led by the descendants of the old Celtic tribes. This was a time of immense political and social upheaval, where the old ways resurfaced, but were now infused with a Romanized sensibility. The leaders of these new kingdoms, who were often former Roman military officers or powerful chieftains, styled themselves as kings, holding court in old Roman villas or newly built hill forts. They were the inheritors of a broken world, and their story is one of a desperate struggle for survival. This period, from roughly 410 to 567 AD, is often called the Age of the Celtic Kingdoms, a time when the Welsh, Cornish, and Northern Britons reasserted their independence. These kingdoms were often at war with each other, a kind of historical free-for-all, fighting over land, resources, and power. The most famous of these kingdoms was perhaps the one in what is now modern-day Wales, where the old British culture and language, which the Romans had never fully extinguished, found a new home and a new purpose. The history of these kingdoms is a deep and abiding mystery. We have no contemporary written records, no detailed chronicles to guide us. We are forced to rely on later sources, like the writings of the British monk Gildas, who wrote a scathing condemnation of the British kings of his time, or the poetic tales of the Welsh bards. Gildas, in his work De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, on the ruin and conquest of Britain, portrays a world of political squabbling, moral decay, and military failure, where the British kings were more interested in fighting each other than in fighting the invaders. His account is a lament, a cry of despair, and a primary source for this period. But it's also a moralistic text, so we have to take it with a grain of historical salt. Another great mystery is the exact geography of these kingdoms. We know the names of a few: Dumnonia in the southwest, Powys in Wales, and Recht in the north, but their boundaries were fluid, and their power was often ephemeral. It's a bit like trying to draw a map of the clouds. They are constantly shifting and changing. A historiographic hypothesis is that these kingdoms, despite their constant infighting, maintained a sense of a shared British identity, a feeling of being a people distinct from the Roman invaders who had just left and the Germanic invaders who were just arriving. My own sleepy little thought is that this shared identity, this sense of being British, was the only thing that held them together. It was a kind of historical glue that prevented them from being completely swallowed up by the chaos. The Celtic kingdoms were, in a sense, the last vestiges of a pre-Roman world, a world of tribal allegiances and warrior chiefs, and their struggle was the final act of the ancient British world. They were, however, a people in a precarious position. Their lands were under constant assault from all sides. The Picts and the Scotti were raiding from the north and west, and a new and far more dangerous threat was emerging on their eastern shores. The most fateful decision of this period was the invitation of Germanic mercenaries, the Anglo-Saxons, to help them fight these threats. The British kings, in their desperation, saw these warriors from what is now Germany and Denmark as a solution to their problems. They were fierce fighters, and they would work for land and pay. This was a classic historical miscalculation, a kind of tragic overestimation of one's own power. The Anglo-Saxons were invited to be a shield, but they would soon become the sword. The arrival of these new peoples marked the beginning of the end for the independent British kingdoms in the East. They were about to be swept away by a new tide of conquest, a new kind of kingdom, and a new language. The stage was set for the formation of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the very ones that would one day become England. The great struggle for Britain was about to enter its next phase, a phase that would decide the fate of the island for the next 1,000 years. In the final centuries of Roman rule, a new type of fortification began to appear along the eastern and southern coasts of Britain. A series of impressive stone fortresses that would come to be known as the Saxon Shore Forts. These weren't the old marching forts or garrisons of the earlier conquests. They were purpose-built defenses, a clear sign that the Romans were no longer concerned with conquering the island, but with defending it from a new and terrifying threat that came from the sea. The name itself, Saxon Shore, is a historical mystery. Does it mean the shore against the Saxons, or the shore of the Saxons? This is an open historiographic question that has puzzled scholars for generations. The forts were built with massive stone walls, often without the typical internal defenses, and were placed at the mouths of rivers and strategic harbors. They were, in a sense, a shield for Roman Britain, a last line of defense against the seaborne raiders from Germania, who were becoming an increasingly serious threat. The commander in charge of these defenses was a high-ranking officer, known as the Count of the Saxon Shore, and his job was to manage the legions and auxiliaries stationed in these forts and to coordinate a naval defense. The forts themselves were a sign of the changing nature of warfare. The old land wars were over, and now the battle was for control of the sea and the rivers. The enemy was no longer a disciplined army, but a collection of fast, hit-and-run raiders who would strike without warning and disappear before a Roman response could be mounted. The forts were designed to be a strong point, a place where a Roman force could be quickly deployed to intercept and repel the invaders. They were, in a way, a recognition of a painful truth. The Romans could no longer defend the entire coast, so they would defend the key strategic points instead. This was a classic Roman strategy of defense in depth, a bit like putting a lock on your front door when the rest of your house is wide open. A major historical mystery is the true role of the Saxon Shore Forts. Were they effective? We know that the raids continued and even intensified. Did they serve as a base for counterattacks, or were they simply a place for the Roman army to retreat to? A historiographic hypothesis is that the forts were not meant to stop all raids, but rather to serve as a deterrent and a way to control the flow of goods and people into the province. They were a kind of customs barrier and a naval base all in one. My own sleepy thought is that they were a testament to the Romans' growing paranoia. They built these massive, expensive fortresses because they were losing control, and they knew it. They were a physical manifestation of a psychological retreat, a final, desperate attempt to hold on to something that was already slipping away. The forts were built in the late 3rd and 4th centuries AD, and some of them, like the one at Pevensey, were used for centuries after the Romans left. They were a part of the landscape, a silent reminder of a time when the Roman Empire was still a power to be reckoned with. But as we recall from our last chapter, the empire was already in a state of terminal decline. The legions stationed in these forts were slowly but surely withdrawn, leaving behind a series of empty stone shells. The Britons, who had been taught to rely on Roman protection, were now left with a few impressive stone buildings and a whole lot of coastline to defend. The forts were a symbol of Roman Britain's defensive posture, a monument to the fear of a new enemy. They were a kind of historical irony. The Romans built these forts to keep the Saxons out, but in the end, they were left to the Saxons, who would come to inhabit them and make them their own. The stage was set for the next chapter, one in which the shield of Britain would be replaced by a new kind of sword. The collapse of Roman authority left the Britons in a state of desperation, facing a three-pronged threat from the Picts, the Scotti, and the Saxons. In their panic, they made a decision that would change the island forever. They hired mercenaries. The British kings, likely following a long-standing Roman tradition of using federated troops, invited Germanic warriors from the tribes of the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes to help them fight their enemies. The story, as told by later historians like the Venerable Bede, is that a British leader, often named Vortigern, offered these warriors land in exchange for military service. They were given a small foothold on the Isle of Thanet in Kent and were meant to act as a kind of historical bouncer, keeping the other raiders out. This seemed like a brilliant plan, a kind of historical let's fight fire with fire strategy. The warriors, led by brothers Hengist and Horsa, were fierce and effective. They fought off the Picts and the Scotti, and for a while the strategy seemed to be working. However, the Britons' relief was short-lived. The Anglo-Saxons, once they had a taste of the fertile British lands, decided they liked it very much indeed. They sent word back to their homelands, telling their people that Britain was a rich, undefended land, and a new wave of migration began. The mercenaries turned on their employers. The old saying, "The cure was worse than the disease," never rang more true. The Anglo-Saxons began to fight not just for pay, but for conquest, and they began to settle in the very lands they were supposed to be defending. This was the beginning of the Anglo-Saxon migration and the subsequent conquest of what would become England. The Britons were pushed westward, their kingdoms slowly but surely being swallowed up by the relentless advance of the new invaders. It was a long, bloody, and piecemeal process, a slow-motion land grab that would last for centuries. This period is one of the most mysterious in British history. We have almost no written sources from the Anglo-Saxon side, and the British sources we have are filled with lamentations and a sense of defeat. A major historical mystery is the scale of the migration. Did a huge number of people cross the North Sea? Or was it a smaller warrior elite who came and conquered a larger British population? The archaeological evidence is mixed, showing a complex picture of both conflict and cultural assimilation. A historiographic hypothesis is that the Anglo-Saxons weren't just brutal conquerors. They also offered a degree of stability and protection that many of the Britons, tired of constant warfare between their own squabbling kings, may have welcomed. My own sleepy thought is that the Britons had grown so used to Roman rule, a system of law and order, that when it was gone, they were completely unprepared for the reality of a world without it. They were a people who had forgotten how to fight for themselves. The Anglo-Saxons, for their part, didn't arrive as a single unified force. They were a collection of different tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes, each with its own customs and leaders. They established their own kingdoms, a series of rival states that would eventually come to dominate the eastern half of the island. The names of these kingdoms, Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, still echo in the names of modern places. The arrival of the Anglo-Saxons marked the end of the post-Roman British period in the East and the beginning of a new age, a kind of historical reset button. The Celtic Britons were now on the defensive, confined to the western fringes of the island. Their language and culture, which had survived the Romans, were now being slowly erased from the majority of the island. The great struggle for Britain was no longer a matter of resisting Roman rule, but a matter of surviving the new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The stage was set for the next chapter, one filled with legends, battles, and the slow, painful birth of a new nation. The period following the Roman withdrawal and the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons is shrouded in a deep historical mist, a kind of historical twilight where fact and legend intermingle. This is the era from which the enduring legends of King Arthur emerge. Was he a real man, a powerful leader who rallied the Britons against the invaders? Or was he a myth, a symbol of hope created in a time of despair? The truth is, we don't know for sure, and that's one of the great historical mysteries. We have no contemporary written records of a man named Arthur. The earliest mentions of him come centuries later in Welsh poetry and historical chronicles, most famously in the works of Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, who embellished the story with all the trappings of a medieval knight. But beneath all the chivalric romance, there is a kernel of historical truth. A historiographic hypothesis is that Arthur was a Romano-British leader, a cavalry commander who used the last remnants of Roman military discipline to fight the Anglo-Saxons. He was not a king of a unified Britain, but a powerful warlord, a kind of military hero who was able to forge a temporary alliance among the fractious British kingdoms and achieve a series of victories against the invaders. The most famous of these is the Battle of Badon, a legendary battle that, according to later sources, saw the Britons achieve a great victory that held back the Saxon advance for a generation. The location of this battle is a complete mystery, a kind of historical shrug. It could have been anywhere from Bath to a hill fort in Wales. The fact that the Anglo-Saxon advance slowed for a while in the mid-5th century gives some credence to the idea of a successful British resistance, a kind of historical exhale. The Britons, for a brief time, were not just running for their lives. They were fighting back. My own sleepy little thought is that Arthur was a kind of historical folk hero, a figure so compelling that his story was passed down through generations, his deeds and victories growing with each retelling until he became the legendary king we know today. He was the hero they needed, a figure of strength and virtue in a world of chaos and uncertainty. This is the period of the sub-Roman kingdoms that we talked about earlier. These were the kingdoms of the Britons, the people who still spoke a Celtic language and who clung to their old traditions. Arthur, if he existed, would have been a leader of these people, a kind of last gasp of the old Romanized world. His story is a testament to the resilience of the British people in the face of an existential threat. The legends of Arthur, however, also serve a historical purpose. They give us a glimpse into the values and fears of the people who created them. They tell us a story of a world where courage and loyalty were paramount, where a single hero could change the course of history. They also tell us a story of a losing battle. For all of Arthur's legendary victories, the Anglo-Saxons continued to advance. The Britons were slowly but surely pushed westward, confined to the lands of Wales and Cornwall, where their language and culture still survive today. The era of the Arthurian legends is not just a story of a great hero, it is a story of a great defeat. It is the story of the last stand of the ancient British kingdoms, a final heroic struggle before they were eclipsed by a new people and a new language. The stage was set for the next chapter, one where the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms would begin to grow and consolidate their power, forever changing the face of the island. The period following the Roman withdrawal and the rise of the Anglo-Saxons is often called the sub-Roman period, a time so poorly documented that it is sometimes referred to as a Dark Age. The name is a bit of a misnomer, as it doesn't mean the people were uneducated or uncivilized. Rather, it means that the historical record is, for the most part, silent. We are left to piece together the narrative from a few fragmented sources, archaeological finds, and a great deal of informed guesswork. This was an era of immense change and upheaval, a time when the Romano-British world was slowly but surely being replaced by a new Anglo-Saxon culture. The old Roman administrative and economic systems had collapsed, and the island had fragmented into a patchwork of competing kingdoms. The Britons, now without the support of the Roman legions, were fighting a desperate battle for survival. The Anglo-Saxons, for their part, were not a single unified force. They were a collection of different tribes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, each with its own leaders and its own ambitions. The conflict between the Britons and the Anglo-Saxons was not a single, decisive war, but a long, piecemeal process of conquest and settlement. The Anglo-Saxons advanced from the east, slowly pushing the Britons westward. This created a new cultural and linguistic divide on the island. The Britons, who spoke a form of Celtic, were pushed into the highlands of Wales, the moors of Cornwall, and the western fringes of what is now England. Here they would preserve their language and culture, a kind of historical refuge. The Anglo-Saxons, who spoke a Germanic language, came to dominate the fertile eastern lowlands. This divide is still evident today in the languages of the British Isles. The historical mystery of this period is the sheer lack of information. How did the Britons' Romanized culture disappear so quickly from the East? Were they all killed? Did they flee? Or did they simply adopt the culture of their new conquerors? A historiographic hypothesis is that the conquest was so thorough that the Britons who remained were a minority and were culturally assimilated into the Anglo-Saxon world. My own sleepy little thought is that it was a bit of all three, a kind of tragic historical buffet of conquest, assimilation, and flight. This was a time of small, local kingdoms, each with its own ruler and its own sphere of influence. We have the names of a few of the British kingdoms, like Dumnonia in the southwest and Reged in the north, but their borders were fluid and their power was ephemeral. This was a world where a king's power was not measured by the size of his kingdom, but by the number of warriors he could command. The Anglo-Saxons, too, were creating their own kingdoms. The names of these kingdoms, Kent, Sussex, Wessex, East Anglia, Mercia, Northumbria, would come to define the political map of England for centuries. They were often at war with each other, a kind of internal struggle for dominance that was as bloody and brutal as their wars with the Britons. The period is marked by a deep sense of a world in flux, a time when the old was dying and the new was struggling to be born. It was an era of hero kings and brutal battles, a world of deep forests and fortified halls, a world that was being forged in the crucible of war. The stage was set for the emergence of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy, a new set of kingdoms that would one day lay the foundations for a unified England. As the dust settled on the British landscape, a new political order began to emerge from the chaos of the sub-Roman period. The Germanic tribes, the Angles, the Saxons, and the Jutes had successfully established a series of powerful kingdoms in the east and center of the island. This collection of 7 main kingdoms is known to historians as the Heptarchy, a term that literally means rule of 7. The names of these kingdoms, Wessex, Sussex, Essex, Kent, East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, were not just political divisions. They were the nascent states that would one day coalesce into the nation of England. This period, from roughly the 6th to the 9th centuries AD, was not one of peace, but of constant competition and warfare. The kingdoms were often at each other's throats, fighting for dominance, for territory, and for tribute. It was a kind of historical Game of Thrones, where alliances were fleeting, and a kingdom's fortune could change with a single battle. Each of these kingdoms had its own distinct character. The Jutes, who were likely the first to arrive in force, established the Kingdom of Kent. The Saxons established Sussex, Essex, and Wessex, with the latter, the West Saxons, eventually becoming the most powerful. The Angles established East Anglia, Mercia, and Northumbria, with Northumbria in the far north, at one point being the largest and most culturally advanced of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Britons, who had been pushed westward, still held onto their own kingdoms in Wales, Cornwall, and Strathclyde, but they were now on the defensive. The old British culture, once dominant, was now a minority culture, confined to the western fringes of the island. The Anglo-Saxons had not just conquered the land, they had replaced the dominant culture. The Celtic language, which had been spoken in the East for centuries, began to die out, replaced by the Old English of the Anglo-Saxons. A major historical mystery of the Heptarchy is the exact nature of their political structure. Was there a single, dominant king who held sway over the others, or was it a true collection of equals? The sources we have from the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and the writings of Bede suggest a constant struggle for a kind of suzerainty, where one king would rise to power and be recognized as a Bretwalda, or wide ruler. But this power was often ephemeral, a product of military might, and it would disappear as soon as a stronger king emerged. It's a bit like a historical game of musical chairs, with the one in charge constantly changing. Another mystery is the speed of the Anglo-Saxon conquest. How did a collection of disparate tribes so quickly establish dominance over the entire eastern half of the island? A historiographic hypothesis is that the Britons, fragmented and demoralized, simply didn't have the military or political will to resist. My own sleepy little thought is that the Anglo-Saxons were simply more organized and ruthless. They were a people who came to a new land with a single purpose: to conquer and to settle. And they were very, very good at it. The period of the Heptarchy was a crucial one in the history of England. It was a time of consolidation and growth, a period when the foundations of a new nation were being laid. It was also a period of immense internal strife. The kingdoms of Mercia and Northumbria, in particular, were often at war, with one rising to a position of dominance, only to be supplanted by the other. This constant internal conflict meant that the Anglo-Saxons were not just fighting the Britons, they were also fighting each other, a kind of self-inflicted wound that would one day make them vulnerable to a new and even more terrifying enemy who was about to arrive from the sea. The stage was set for the next chapter, one where a single king, a man who would come to be known as the Great, would finally begin the long, difficult process of uniting these disparate kingdoms into a single, cohesive nation. The birth of England was just around the corner. Of all the kingdoms that made up the Heptarchy, none would prove to be as historically significant as Wessex. The kingdom of the West Saxons, located in the fertile lowlands of southern England, began as a relatively minor player in the great game of Anglo-Saxon politics. For centuries, it was overshadowed by the military might of Mercia and the cultural and intellectual prowess of Northumbria. But slowly and surely, through a combination of shrewd leadership, military victories, and good fortune, Wessex began its long, deliberate ascent to power. Its rise was not a sudden burst of glory, but a slow, methodical grind, a kind of historical long game that would culminate in the unification of England. The foundations of this power were laid by a series of able kings, but none would be as important as the man who would come to be known as Alfred the Great. He was not the first powerful king of Wessex, but he was the one who would truly set it on a path to greatness. Before Alfred, the most notable king of Wessex was probably Egbert, who, in the early 9th century, decisively defeated the Mercians and brought much of southern England under his sway. He was a Bretwalda, a title for a king who had supremacy over the other Anglo-Saxon rulers. But his power, like that of his predecessors, was ephemeral. It was not a unified kingdom, but a collection of tribute-paying states. The real challenge for Wessex, however, was not from the other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but from a new and terrifying enemy that was about to arrive from the sea. They were the Vikings, and their arrival would change the course of English history forever. The rise of Wessex is an interesting case study in the nature of power. It didn't have the grand early cultural achievements of Northumbria, which gave us the magnificent Lindisfarne Gospels and the historian Bede. It didn't have the early military dominance of Mercia. What it had was a stable agricultural base and a series of pragmatic and forward-thinking leaders. This is an open historical mystery. Why was it Wessex, a relatively latecomer to the game, that would ultimately succeed in unifying England? A historiographic hypothesis is that its geographical location on the southern coast made it a natural hub for trade and a strategic launching point for military campaigns. It was a bit like being in the middle of a historical chessboard. You could move in any direction you wanted. My own sleepy thought is that they were just a bit better at playing the long game, while the other kingdoms were busy squabbling with each other. Wessex was quietly consolidating its power, building a strong administrative and military system that would serve them well in the coming storm. The political situation in the Heptarchy was a kind of historical merry-go-round, with the power swinging from Northumbria to Mercia and then finally to Wessex. This constant internal strife, while a source of much bloodshed, also had the effect of weeding out the weaker kingdoms and forcing the survivors to become stronger and more unified. The Anglo-Saxons, for all their internal feuding, were a people who were being forged in the crucible of conflict, and they were about to face their greatest test. The Vikings, who had started as small-scale raiders, were now arriving in force, not to plunder, but to conquer and to settle. They were known as the Great Heathen Army, and they were about to bring the entire Anglo-Saxon world to the brink of collapse. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation, one that would pit the nascent kingdom of Wessex against a new kind of enemy, a confrontation that would define the legacy of Alfred the Great. The long, bloody road to a unified England was just beginning. While the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were busy fighting each other for supremacy, a different kind of change was sweeping across the land, one that would prove to be as profound as any military conquest: the conversion to Christianity. The Anglo-Saxons were pagan, worshipping a pantheon of gods with names that still echo in our days of the week, like Woden, Wednesday, and Thunor, Thursday. But in Rome, a new spiritual force was stirring, one that would not be content with just a city, but would seek to conquer the world with ideas rather than legions. The story of the conversion is one of two parallel missions. The first was the Irish mission, a kind of grassroots effort led by monks from Ireland who were converting the Picts in the north. This mission, with its isolated monasteries and ascetic monks, was a quiet but effective force for change. The second and more historically significant was the Roman mission, which arrived on the shores of Kent in 597 AD. The leader of this mission was a monk named Augustine, sent by Pope Gregory the Great. He landed in the Kingdom of Kent, which was at the time ruled by King Ethelbert, a man who, perhaps sensing the winds of change, was open to the new religion. His wife, Bertha, was already a Christian from the Frankish court, a kind of historical foot in the door. The story goes that Augustine and his monks, with their banners and hymns, approached the king, who, in a classic display of Anglo-Saxon caution, insisted on meeting them outdoors so that they couldn't cast any spells on him. Augustine's message was a simple one of peace, love, and salvation, and it must have seemed utterly foreign to a people whose religion was so intertwined with warfare and sacrifice. King Ethelbert was convinced, and he was baptized, and with his conversion, the Roman mission had its first major victory. From Kent, the missionaries spread out, establishing churches and converting the local population. It was not a smooth process. There were setbacks, backslidings, and resistance, and it took centuries for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms to fully convert. The conversion to Christianity is one of the great historical mysteries of this period. Why were the Anglo-Saxons, a people of fierce warriors and deeply held pagan beliefs, so willing to abandon their old gods? Was it a genuine spiritual conversion, or was it a pragmatic political decision? A historiographic hypothesis is that the kings saw Christianity as a way to consolidate their power. It gave them a new source of authority, one that was not based on their lineage or military might, but on a divine right from God. It also gave them access to the administrative and cultural tools of the Roman world, like writing and law, which had been lost in the post-Roman chaos. My own sleepy little thought is that the Anglo-Saxons, for all their brutality, were a people who were a bit lost. They had abandoned their homelands, and their old gods seemed to have failed them. Christianity, with its promise of a new kind of community and a new kind of life, must have been a very appealing alternative. The arrival of Christianity had a profound and lasting effect on the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It brought them into the wider world of Europe. Monasteries became centers of learning and culture, and they produced magnificent works of art, like the Lindisfarne Gospels, and great thinkers, like the Venerable Bede, who would become the first great historian of the English people. The Church also had a unifying effect. It created a single religious identity that transcended the squabbling kingdoms and laid the groundwork for a future unified England. This was a kind of peaceful conquest, one that was as significant as any military victory. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been forged in war, but they were now being shaped by a new spiritual force, one that would give them a new identity and a new purpose. This was a world on the cusp of a new and terrible storm. For centuries, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had been fighting each other, a constant internal struggle for dominance. But in the late 8th century, a new and terrifying threat emerged from the sea, one that would force them to either unite or be destroyed. They were the Vikings, seaborne raiders from Scandinavia, who, in their longships, were a new and terrifying kind of enemy. They were a people of immense physical courage and a deep love of plunder. They first appeared in 793 AD with a sudden and brutal raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, an intellectual and religious center on the coast of Northumbria. The attack was a profound shock to the Anglo-Saxon world. Monasteries, with their wealth and their lack of defenses, were easy targets, and the Vikings, who were pagan, had no qualms about desecrating and plundering these holy sites. This was not just a military invasion, it was a cultural one. The Vikings were not just looking for treasure, they were looking for land, and their raids were a prelude to a full-scale conquest. The raids grew in frequency and intensity. The small coastal attacks of the late 8th century gave way to full-scale invasions in the 9th century. In 865 AD, a massive Viking force known as the Great Heathen Army landed in East Anglia. This was not a raiding party. It was an army of conquest. It was a kind of historical sledgehammer, and it proceeded to smash its way through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. The Heptarchy, which had been so busy fighting itself, was completely unprepared for this new, unified enemy. The Vikings were a military machine. They were a bit like a historical shark, always moving, always looking for a new place to attack. They defeated the kingdoms of Northumbria and East Anglia, and they forced the kingdom of Mercia to pay tribute. By the late 9th century, only one Anglo-Saxon kingdom was left standing, a single, lonely bastion against the Viking tide. That kingdom was Wessex, and its king was Alfred. The arrival of the Vikings is one of the great historical mysteries of the era. Why did they start raiding now? Was it a result of population pressure in Scandinavia? Or was it simply an opportunity, a kind of historical vacuum created by the decline of the Frankish and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms? A historiographic hypothesis is that the development of a new kind of ship, the long ship, gave them the ability to travel farther and faster than ever before. This was a kind of technological revolution that changed the nature of warfare. My own sleepy thought is that they were simply bored. They were a people of warriors who had grown tired of farming and needed a new, exciting hobby. And what could be more exciting than sailing to a new land and taking all its gold? The Viking raids were a wake-up call for the Anglo-Saxons. They had been living in a state of internal conflict for too long, and now they were facing an enemy that was not interested in tribute or a temporary victory, but in total conquest. The Anglo-Saxon world was on the brink of collapse, and its future rested on the shoulders of one man, a king who was a scholar and a warrior, a man who would come to define the English nation. The stage was set for the great confrontation, a struggle that would not only decide the fate of Wessex, but of all of England. The Vikings had brought a storm to the shores of Britain, and it would take a hero of mythic proportions to weather it. The story of Alfred the Great was about to begin, with the great heathen army tearing through the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. Only one remained standing, Wessex, and its king, a man of surprising strength and intellect, was about to become a legend. His name was Alfred, and he was a man who, by all accounts, was not a natural-born warrior. He was a scholar, a man who loved learning, but he was thrust into a role that demanded he be a military genius and a political leader. He was forced to fight a war of survival against an enemy that seemed unstoppable. In 878 AD, the Vikings, led by a fearsome leader named Guthrum, launched a surprise attack that nearly captured Alfred and his family, forcing him to flee into the swamps and marshes of Somerset. This was his lowest moment, the kind of historical rock bottom that makes for a good story. For a while, it seemed as if the Viking conquest of England was complete. The other kingdoms had fallen, and Wessex was on the brink of collapse. But Alfred was not a man to give up easily. He used his time in hiding to regroup, to plan, and to gather his forces. He was a master of logistics and strategy, and he understood that you couldn't beat the Vikings with a single disorganized army. You had to fight them on their own terms, with a standing army and a network of fortified towns. This was a radical idea for the time. The Anglo-Saxons had relied on a militia, a fyrd, that was called up in times of crisis. But it was a system that was too slow and too disorganized to deal with the fast, mobile Viking armies. Alfred's new idea was a series of fortified boroughs, or burhs, that would serve as a defensive network, a place where the population could take refuge and from which a smaller, more disciplined army could launch a counterattack. The turning point came at the Battle of Edington in 878 AD. Alfred, having secretly rallied his forces, launched a surprise attack on the main Viking army. It was a decisive and complete victory, a moment of pure historical triumph. Guthrum and his forces were routed, and Alfred, in a move of remarkable statesmanship, offered them a peace treaty. It was a kind of historical, "I'll let you live, but you have to become my friend" moment. The treaty, known as the Treaty of Wedmore, established a clear border between Alfred's kingdom of Wessex and the Viking-controlled territory in the north and east, which would come to be known as the Danelaw. Guthrum, in a sign of his submission, was baptized a Christian, with Alfred as his godfather. The story of Alfred the Great is one of the great historical mysteries. How did a man who was so ill for most of his life, a man who loved learning so much, manage to become such a brilliant and ruthless military leader? A historiographic hypothesis is that he was a man who was forged by the crucible of conflict. He had no choice but to become a warrior, and he was so successful because he was smarter than his enemies. My own sleepy thought is that he was a man who simply refused to lose. He saw his people and his culture on the brink of destruction, and he decided, in his quiet and scholarly way, that he was not going to let that happen. He was the kind of hero you don't expect, the one who wins with his mind and his heart as much as with his sword. He was not just a great king, he was the savior of the English people, a man who, in a moment of despair, laid the foundations for a unified England. The Treaty of Wedmore did not bring an end to the Viking threat, but it did create a new and stable reality for the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. It established a clear border between Alfred's Wessex and the Viking-controlled territory, a region that would come to be known as the Danelaw. This was not a small, insignificant piece of land. It encompassed much of northern and eastern England, including the old kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and parts of Mercia. This was a land ruled by Viking kings, a place where Norse law and customs were supreme. It was a kind of historical experiment, a new kind of kingdom that was a blend of Anglo-Saxon and Viking cultures. The Danelaw was a constant source of tension and a kind of cultural and political wall between the two peoples. But it also, in a strange way, laid the groundwork for the future unification of England. Alfred, for his part, was not content with just surviving. He was a man who understood that defense was not enough. He set about a long and deliberate campaign to rebuild his kingdom and to lay the groundwork for a reconquest. He didn't just fight the Vikings, he outmaneuvered them in every way. He created a new kind of army, one that was more mobile and more disciplined. He built a new navy, a fleet of ships that were bigger and faster than the Viking longships, a kind of historical upgrade. He also established a network of fortified towns, the burhs, that were a military and economic marvel. These burhs were not just forts, they were also centers of trade and administration, a kind of historical city-building project that would become the backbone of his kingdom's power. He was a man who understood that a kingdom was not just a collection of lands, but a network of people and resources, and he worked tirelessly to knit his kingdom together. The story of the Danelaw is one of the great historical mysteries of this period. We know that the Vikings settled there, but did they replace the Anglo-Saxon population, or did the two peoples live side by side? The archaeological evidence suggests a complex picture of coexistence and cultural exchange. Place names in the region, with their Scandinavian roots, are a silent reminder of the Viking presence. The fact that the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings were able to live together for so long is a historical puzzle. A historiographic hypothesis is that the two peoples, despite their differences, had more in common than we might think. They were both Germanic peoples, and their languages were related. My own sleepy thought is that they were a people who, after so much war, were simply tired of fighting and were willing to make a kind of peace, a kind of historical shrug, and a let's just get on with it attitude. The legacy of Alfred the Great was not just the survival of his kingdom. It was the beginning of the end of the Heptarchy. His successors, his son Edward the Elder and his grandson Athelstan, would continue his work, slowly but surely conquering the Danelaw and bringing the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms under a single rule. It was a long and bloody process, a series of battles and sieges that would last for over 50 years. But by 927 AD, Athelstan, a man who would come to be known as the first king of England, would finally achieve what no other king had been able to do. He would unify the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms into a single, cohesive nation. The Danelaw was gone, but its legacy would remain, a kind of historical scar that would shape the English people for centuries. The birth of England was complete, but the struggle for the island was far from over. A new kind of Viking, a new kind of threat, was about to emerge. With the unification of England under the Anglo-Saxon kings, a new period of relative peace and stability dawned. But this peace was not to last. The Vikings, who had been pushed out of the Danelaw, were not a people to give up easily. They returned in a new form, not as land-hungry settlers, but as powerful kings from Scandinavia, who saw the rich, unified kingdom of England as a prize to be won. The late 10th and early 11th centuries were marked by a series of devastating raids and invasions led by Scandinavian kings like Svein Forkbeard and his son, Cnut the Great. In 1016 AD, Cnut, after a long and brutal campaign, finally conquered England and became its king. He was not a conqueror who sought to destroy the Anglo-Saxon world, but to rule it. He became a Christian, married an Anglo-Saxon queen, and ruled a vast North Sea empire that included Denmark, Norway, and England. For a time, it seemed that England would become a part of a new Scandinavian empire, a kind of historical turn of events that no one could have predicted. But the story of Anglo-Saxon England was not yet over. After Cnut's death, his empire fell apart, and the Anglo-Saxon line of kings was restored in the person of Edward the Confessor, a man who, having spent most of his life in Normandy, was a bit of a historical fish out of water. He was a devoutly religious man, and his reign was marked by a kind of historical quietude, a kind of final, peaceful chapter before the storm. But he was also a man who had no direct heir, and this simple fact set the stage for one of the most dramatic and consequential moments in British history, the succession crisis of 1066. The crisis was a kind of historical ticking time bomb, and it had three main players, each with a claim to the throne. The first was Harold Godwinson, a powerful Anglo-Saxon earl who had been a loyal servant of Edward the Confessor. He was, by all accounts, the most popular and competent candidate. The second was William of Normandy, a powerful duke from France who claimed that Edward had promised him the throne. The third was Harald Hardrada, a fearsome Viking king of Norway who also claimed a right to the throne through a complex web of old treaties and family ties. The period leading up to 1066 is one of the great historical mysteries. What was Edward the Confessor's true intention? Did he promise the throne to William, as the Normans claimed? Or did he, on his deathbed, give the throne to Harold, as the Anglo-Saxons claimed? The truth is, we don't know for sure. The sources are biased, and the evidence is circumstantial. A historiographic hypothesis is that Edward was a man who, having lived in two worlds, was simply trying to keep his options open, and that he didn't make a clear decision. My own sleepy little thought is that he was a bit of a historical prankster, and he knew that his lack of a clear heir would cause a complete and utter mess, and he just found it a bit amusing. I mean, who can blame him? The stage was set for a dramatic, three-way struggle for the throne, a kind of historical showdown that would decide the fate of England for the next 1,000 years. This was the end of the Anglo-Saxon world as a single, unified entity, and the beginning of a new chapter, one that would be written in blood. The final act of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms was about to begin. The year 1066 was a year of destiny for England, a kind of historical showdown that would decide the fate of the Anglo-Saxon world. With Edward the Confessor dead and no clear heir, the throne was up for grabs, and the man who seized it was Harold Godwinson, a powerful Anglo-Saxon earl who was, by all accounts, a competent and well-liked leader. He was crowned king by the Witan, the Anglo-Saxon Council of Elders, a kind of historical vote of confidence. But his reign was to be the shortest in English history, a whirlwind of battles and betrayals that would end in tragedy. His first challenge came from the north, from his own brother, Tostig Godwinson, and a fearsome Viking king, Harald Hardrada, a man who, as we remember from our last section, had a claim to the throne. This was a massive invasion force, a kind of historical pincer movement that was designed to catch Harold by surprise. Harold, however, was not a man to be caught off guard. He gathered his army and marched north with a speed that was, for the time, simply astonishing. He covered over 185 miles in just 4 days, a kind of historical forced march that would tire out even the most hardened soldiers. He met the invaders at the Battle of Stamford Bridge on September 25th, 1066. It was a decisive and bloody victory for the Anglo-Saxons. Harold's forces, with their disciplined shield wall, routed the Vikings, killing both his brother and Harold Hardrada. The Viking threat to England, which had been a constant source of terror for centuries, was finally and definitively ended. It was a moment of pure historical triumph, a kind of glorious end to a long and brutal conflict. But Harold's victory was short-lived. Just 3 days after the battle, a new and even more terrifying threat arrived on the southern coast of England. William of Normandy, the other claimant to the throne, had finally launched his invasion. He had been waiting for weeks for a favorable wind, and now, with Harold's army exhausted and far to the north, he had his chance. He landed at Pevensey Bay on the south coast, a kind of historical dagger plunged into the heart of England. Harold, upon hearing the news, had to make a decision. He could wait for his army to rest, or he could march south to meet the new threat. He chose to march, a kind of historical gamble that would not pay off. His army, tired and depleted from their long march and their brutal battle, was no match for the fresh, disciplined forces of William. The two armies met at the Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066. It was a long and brutal battle, a kind of historical slugfest that lasted for an entire day. Harold's army, with its famous shield wall, held firm against the Norman cavalry for most of the day. But William was a brilliant tactician, and his forces, using a feigned retreat to break the shield wall, were able to turn the tide. The battle ended when Harold was killed, a moment that marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon rule and the beginning of a new Norman-French dynasty. The story of Harold Godwinson is a tragic one, a kind of historical what if. What would have happened if he had not had to fight 2 battles? What if he had been able to rest his army? The truth is, we don't know for sure. But what we do know is that his death marked the end of an era. The Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, which had been forged in the crucible of war, were now to be ruled by a new kind of conqueror. The Norman Conquest was about to begin. With Harold Godwinson dead at the Battle of Hastings, William, Duke of Normandy, was now the de facto King of England. But his conquest was far from complete. The Anglo-Saxon nobility, in a final act of defiance, crowned the young Edgar Etheling as their king, a kind of historical last gasp. But William was a man of action and a master of military strategy. He marched his army to London, where the city elders, seeing the writing on the wall, submitted to him. He was crowned King of England on Christmas Day, 1066, in Westminster Abbey, the very church that had been built by his predecessor, Edward the Confessor. This was not a moment of peace, but the beginning of a long and brutal campaign to consolidate his power. William was a ruthless and pragmatic ruler, and he understood that he couldn't rule England without breaking the power of the Anglo-Saxon elite. The Norman Conquest was a top-down affair. William did not just take the throne, he took the land. He systematically dispossessed the Anglo-Saxon earls and thegns, a kind of historical land redistribution, and replaced them with his own Norman followers. He built a series of castles, like the Tower of London, a kind of historical stamp of authority, to solidify his control and to intimidate the local population. The Normans were a people who understood the power of a good fortress. The Anglo-Saxons, for their part, did not give up without a fight. There were a series of rebellions and uprisings in the years following the conquest, the most famous of which was the rebellion in the north, which William crushed with a brutal campaign known as the Harrying of the North. He systematically destroyed crops and villages, a kind of historical scorched earth policy that led to a famine, and a famine that wiped out a huge portion of the population. This was a moment of pure historical ruthlessness, a testament to William's will to rule. The consolidation of Norman power was not just a military affair. It was also an administrative one. William commissioned the Domesday Book, a massive survey of all the land and property in England, a kind of historical census that was used to assess taxes and to establish his legal claim to the entire kingdom. It was an incredibly meticulous document, a testament to the Norman love of order and administration. This was not just a change in rulers. It was a complete and total change in the social and political structure of England. The Anglo-Saxon aristocracy was replaced by a new Norman French one. The language of the court and the law became Norman French, and the Old English of the Anglo-Saxons was pushed to the background. The Norman Conquest is a historical mystery in its own right. Why was it so successful? The Anglo-Saxons, as we know, were a people who had successfully fought off the Vikings for centuries. A historiographic hypothesis is that the Anglo-Saxon world was simply too fractured and exhausted from its internal conflicts to resist a unified professional army. My own sleepy thought is that the Normans were a kind of historical perfect storm. They were a people who combined the military prowess of the Vikings with the administrative and legal skills of the French, a kind of historical synthesis that made them a truly formidable force. The Norman Conquest brought an end to the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms as independent entities. The story of ancient British tribal kingdoms, with their shifting borders and their constant internal strife, was finally at an end. A new, unified, and more centralized England was about to be born, one that would be forged from a new kind of conquest. While the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of the East were being conquered and consolidated by the Normans, the old Celtic Britons had not disappeared entirely. Pushed to the western fringes of the island, they had preserved their language, their culture, and their independence. This was a kind of historical exile, but it was also a historical refuge. The old British kingdoms that had fragmented after the Roman withdrawal had found a new home in the mountainous terrain of Wales, the rugged peninsula of Cornwall, and the northern kingdom of Strathclyde. Here, the Celtic language, which was now distinct from the Germanic languages of the Anglo-Saxons and the Norman French, continued to be spoken, a kind of historical island in a sea of foreign tongues. The Britons of these regions were a people who had successfully resisted the Romanization of their culture and, for a time, the Anglo-Saxon conquest. They were, in a sense, the last vestiges of a pre-Roman world, a people who had held on to their old ways with a fierce and unyielding tenacity. The history of these kingdoms is a deep and abiding mystery. We have a few written sources from the Welsh bards and monks, but they are often filled with heroic tales and a strong sense of a golden age that was lost. The Welsh kingdoms of Gwynedd, Powys, and Deheubarth were often at war with each other, a kind of internal struggle for dominance that was as bloody and brutal as the Heptarchy. But they were also united by a common enemy, the Anglo-Saxons, and later the Normans. The Normans, with their relentless love of conquest, would spend centuries trying to subdue the Welsh, and they would do it with a series of massive stone castles that still stand today, a kind of historical testament to the difficulty of their task. The Welsh, for their part, would never be fully conquered. They would hold on to their language and their culture, and their struggle for independence would become a part of the national identity of Wales. The stories of their heroic princes and their valiant battles against the English are a part of the national mythos, a kind of historical resistance that has endured for centuries. One of the great historical mysteries is the fate of the Cornish people. We know that they were a distinct people with their own language and culture, but over time they were slowly assimilated into the English world. Why was it that the Welsh were able to preserve their culture and the Cornish were not? A historiographic hypothesis is that the geography of Cornwall, with its proximity to the English heartland, made it easier for the English to conquer and to settle there. The Welsh, with their mountainous terrain, were more difficult to conquer and to assimilate. My own sleepy thought is that the Cornish were a people who, after a long and hard struggle, simply gave up. They were a people who, in a moment of historical exhaustion, decided that it was easier to join the English than to fight them. The legacy of the Celtic Britons is not just a story of loss and defeat. It is also a story of a kind of historical resilience. They were a people who, despite being pushed to the margins of their own island, held on to their language and their identity. The Welsh language, in particular, is one of the oldest living languages in Europe, a kind of historical miracle. The story of the Celtic Britons is a reminder that history is not just a story of winners and losers. It is also a story of survival, of a people who, despite all odds, held on to their culture and their identity. Their story is a kind of historical parallel to the Anglo-Saxon story. While the Anglo-Saxons were building a new nation, the Britons were trying to hold on to their old one. The two stories, in their own way, are a kind of historical yin and yang, a story of two peoples who, in their own way, were fighting for the soul of the island. The Norman Conquest was not just a military conquest. It was a cultural one, a kind of historical blender that would forever change the linguistic and cultural landscape of England. The Anglo-Saxons, who had already absorbed a great deal of Celtic and Roman influence, were now to be ruled by a new elite who spoke Norman French, a kind of historical double whammy. The result was a profound and lasting cultural fusion, a blend of Celtic, Anglo-Saxon, and Norman French cultures that would create the unique foundations of medieval and eventually modern England. The most visible manifestation of this fusion was the English language itself. Before the conquest, the language of the island was Old English, a Germanic language that was as foreign to modern ears as German is today. After the conquest, the language of the court, the law, and the nobility was Norman French, a Romance language. The language of the church was Latin. The Anglo-Saxon peasants, however, still spoke Old English, and over time, the two languages began to merge. Norman French words were adopted into Old English, and the grammar began to simplify. The result was a new language, Middle English, a kind of historical Frankenstein's monster that was a blend of Germanic and Romance languages. This linguistic shift is one of the great historical mysteries. How did a language that was spoken by a small conquering elite manage to so profoundly influence the language of the majority? A historiographic hypothesis is that the Norman Conquest was so total and so thorough that the Anglo-Saxons, in order to get ahead, had to learn the language of their new rulers. My own sleepy thought is that the two languages, in their own way, just got along. They were a kind of historical odd couple that, in the end, fell in love and created something new and beautiful. The English language is a kind of historical record of this fusion. Our words for food, for instance, are often Anglo-Saxon for the animal and Norman French for the cooked dish. The animal is a cow, Anglo-Saxon, but the meat is beef, Norman French. The animal is a pig, Anglo-Saxon, but the meat is pork, Norman French. It's a kind of historical nod to the fact that the Anglo-Saxons were the ones who did the farming and the Normans were the ones who did the eating. It's a funny little historical detail that speaks volumes. The cultural fusion was not just linguistic. The Normans brought a new kind of social and political structure, feudalism, a system of land ownership and loyalty that replaced the Anglo-Saxon system of loyalty to a king. They also brought a new kind of architecture, with massive stone castles and cathedrals that were a stark contrast to the wooden halls and churches of the Anglo-Saxons. The Normans were a people who built to last, and their buildings, like the Tower of London, are a kind of historical monument to their power. The Anglo-Saxons, for their part, continued to practice their own traditions and customs, and over time, the two cultures began to blend. This was not a quick and easy process. It took centuries, and it was often a source of conflict. But in the end, the two peoples, in their own way, became one. The legacy of this cultural fusion is all around us. It's in our language, in our architecture, and in our social and political institutions. The Normans, in a way, finished what the Romans had started. They took a collection of disparate, warring kingdoms and united them into a single, cohesive nation. But unlike the Romans, who left behind a legacy of roads and villas, the Normans left behind a legacy of a new kind of people, a new kind of culture, and a new kind of nation. The story of the ancient British tribal kingdoms was over, and the story of England was just beginning. The Norman Conquest of 1066 was not just another historical event. It was a definitive and irreversible end to a long and tumultuous era. The story we have been following, a story of ancient British tribal kingdoms, their struggles against the Romans, their fragmentation after the Roman withdrawal, and their eventual subjugation by the Anglo-Saxons and Normans, had finally come to a close. The death of Harold Godwinson on the battlefield at Hastings marked the end of the Anglo-Saxon dynasty, a line of kings that had, in its own way, successfully navigated the treacherous waters of the post-Roman world and had managed to forge a single, unified kingdom. The Normans, with their new language, their new social structure, and their new style of warfare, were not just another group of conquerors. They were the final conquerors, the ones who would finally put a stop to the seemingly endless cycle of invasions and internal conflicts. The Norman Conquest was a kind of historical punctuation mark, a full stop at the end of a long and bloody sentence. The end of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms also marked the end of a way of life. The Anglo-Saxons were a people of farmers and warriors, a people who lived in wooden halls and were loyal to a king, but also to a lord. Their world was one of mead halls and heroic poetry, a world that was, in its own way, a continuation of the old tribal kingdoms. The Normans, for their part, were a people who built in stone, a people who were more concerned with law and administration than with epic poems. They were a kind of historical upgrade, a new kind of social and political system that would replace the old. The Normans were a people who understood power in a new way. They were not just a collection of warriors. They were a bureaucracy. The Domesday Book was a perfect example of this. It was a document of immense power, a tool of administration that allowed William to know exactly who owned what and how much tax they owed. This was a kind of historical bookkeeping that the Anglo-Saxons, for all their prowess in battle, had never fully mastered. The final end of the tribal kingdoms was, in a way, a quiet one. The Welsh and the Cornish, as we talked about earlier, were still there, clinging to their old ways, but their power was gone. They were no longer a threat to the English throne. They were simply a historical holdout, a kind of historical museum piece. The story of the ancient tribal kingdoms was no longer a part of the mainstream of English history. It was a historical sidebar. This was the result of a long, slow process of conquest, assimilation, and displacement. The Romans had started it, the Anglo-Saxons had continued it, and the Normans had finally finished it. The island of Britain, which had once been a patchwork of different kingdoms, was now a single, unified nation, a new kind of kingdom that was a blend of all the peoples who had come before. The Norman Conquest, in a way, was the final act of the ancient world in Britain. It was the moment when the island was finally brought into the mainstream of European history, a new world of chivalry and cathedrals. The old world of hill forts and mead halls was gone, replaced by a new kind of order, a new kind of nation, and a new kind of people. The end of the story is not a happy one for the ancient Britons or the Anglo-Saxons. It is a story of loss and defeat, but it is also a story of a new beginning, a kind of historical phoenix that would rise from the ashes of the old world. The final chapter of our story is not about what was lost, but about what remains, the enduring mysteries and echoes of this lost world in our own. As we come to the end of our journey through the history of ancient British tribal kingdoms, we are left not with a neat, tidy ending, but with a series of enduring mysteries and a profound sense of a world that is at once alien and deeply familiar. The Norman Conquest brought a definitive end to the independent tribal and Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, but it did not erase the past. The echoes of these lost worlds are all around us, in the names of our towns and rivers, in our language, and in our very identity. We are, in a sense, a living testament to the long and bloody history of this island, a kind of historical tapestry woven from the threads of Celtic, Roman, Anglo-Saxon, and Norman cultures. The story we've told is not a story of a single, unified people, but a story of many peoples, each with their own hopes, fears, and dreams. The most enduring mystery of all is the one that has been with us from the very beginning, the mystery of the people themselves. We have names for their kings and their tribes, but what did they sound like? What did they feel? What did they think about when they stood on a hill and looked out at the misty valleys? We have a few archaeological artifacts, a few broken stones, but we will never know the full story. The silence of the past is one of the most powerful things in the world, and it is a reminder that history is not just a collection of facts, but a collection of questions, a kind of historical conversation that we are all a part of. We can only hypothesize a quiet thought in the night that they were a people who, just like us, loved, laughed, and cried. The Romans called them Britons. But who were they to themselves? What did they call their land before the Romans came? These are questions that will likely never be answered, and that is perhaps for the best. It leaves a little room for our own imagination, a little space for us to fill in the blanks. The historical facts we've covered, from Caesar's brief raids to the final Norman conquest, are the bones of the story. The mysteries are the soul. The standing stones, the hill forts, the Roman roads that still crisscross the country, they are all a kind of historical echo, a silent reminder of a world that is both lost and still with us. The legacy of the ancient British tribal kingdoms is not a single grand narrative, but a series of overlapping stories, a kind of historical palimpsest, where each layer is a part of the whole. The Celtic Britons, who were pushed to the margins of the island, held on to their culture with a fierce tenacity, and their language is a living testament to their survival. The Anglo-Saxons, who came as conquerors, became a new kind of people, a new kind of nation, and their language is the foundation of our own. The Normans, who came as the final conquerors, finished the job, but they also added a new layer of culture and language that made us who we are today. The story of England is not a story of purity, but a story of fusion, a story of a people who, through a long and often brutal process, were forged into a single, cohesive nation. And so we come to the end. The history of the ancient British tribal kingdoms is a story of a long and often brutal struggle for survival. It is a story of heroes and villains, of triumphs and tragedies, and of a people who, in the end, were not conquered but transformed. As you drift off to sleep, let the mists of time swirl around you. Imagine a time of hill forts and warrior queens, of Roman legions and Viking longships. The past is not a foreign country. It's a part of who we are. Wishing you peace, rest, and maybe a little historical inspiration before sleep. Good night.